Well, let's break some of that down for you now. I'm joined live via Skype by McClory, Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities. Always good to have you on, Dan.
Thanks, Rachelle.
So obviously a lot of what caught people's attention was China now putting regulations on the export of some technologies. Now, some analysts say this is a response to recent moves by the U.S. Is that your take, or are other factors at play?
I think it is. I think it's in direct response, and some might say a delayed response because it took a period of time, but this was passed back in the middle of October, so we knew it was coming. But I think it most certainly has to do with the other transactions that you cited involving Huawei, ByteDance, Tencent. So China is now asserting itself with some similar controls.
So what sort of initial response do you expect from businesses and investors?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, it has to start with clarity. So some straightforward definitions of what sectors will be affected. I think some of the speculation, Rachelle, has been in the overall supply chain. So it's not just goods, for example, coming out of China and going directly into the United States, but it could be going to a second or a third country. Maybe it's being reassembled and then ultimately shipped to the United States. So there's some concern over how far-reaching this is going to be, and it's not just a direct from point A to point B. That's one. And the second, you know, is I think there is an expectation for some of the obvious sectors, which would be things such as military use, which, you know, quite normally many countries have those type of controls. But I think clarification of exactly what's being codified and what will be subject to this is what everyone's waiting to hear.
And that's interesting that you mentioned the supply chain. So then do we have any idea then which industries this will help or hurt the most at this point?
Well, you have to look at things like consumer electronics. You have to look at mobile phones. Then you move into things like telecommunications equipment, some of which subjectively could be classified as being on these restrictive lists or these export bans. I think that's one. But then if you look at subcomponents of many of those electronic products, specifically mobile phones, and even into things such as e-vehicles and e-batteries, you get into rare earths. And, you know, rare earths is an area where China has literally cornered the global market, somewhere around 80% of the output. So it's still not known for sure whether or not that is going to end up on the list. And if so, which aspects of the rare earth minerals themselves will. But in speculation, prices of some of those rare earth commodities have already started to climb.
So then if this is mostly in response to the U.S.'s actions, how do you expect this law to impact broader bilateral trade as well as cross-border investment?
Well, you're right, because it's not just as simple as I call it, point A and point B, or the U.S. and China. And especially when you think, Rachelle, about something we discussed not too long ago, RCEP, and how that all came together with some of the ASEAN countries. You know, you wouldn't want to endanger or jeopardize that in terms of restrictions that would serve to defeat the purpose of why that was put together. So I think countries want to know sort of who's in and who's out, and also, as I mentioned earlier, what particular products and commodities are going to be affected. But it could very likely have the possibility of jeopardizing some of the trade relations, depending upon how far-reaching these export restrictions might be.
Because we did see that a big part of the law is algorithms that are going to be subject to these regulations. How do you see that coming into play when it comes to the sale of companies like TikTok, if that ends up happening?
Well, clearly, Rachelle, now we're getting into the underlying technology, which everyone has a concern about. So, you know, are companies and countries going to be compelled, if not forced, to divulge what's inside the technology in order to clear it from the relative authorities? And so that's another area of concern. But, you know, as you're mentioning, one of the reasons why the Chinese government stepped in and said we're not going to allow ByteDance to sell TikTok or a portion of it to the U.S. was because of those underlying technologies. They saw those as being highly proprietary and ones that they didn't want to get into certain hands. So technologies and all of those, let's say, non-hard goods are really going to be quite an area of inquiry and speculation as to how constrained they may or may not be.
Just very quickly, I have about 15 seconds. Obviously, all this came from the Trump administration, but now you have an incoming Biden administration. So is this the latest salvo in a new tech Cold War? And with the new administration now coming in, how far does this go?
I think Biden toes the line. I think he keeps it, in somewhat of the same vein that it was with Trump. And, he's not going to unilaterally abandon the quote-unquote trade war or the negotiations. He's not going to give up or give in, at least immediately. The expectation would be that he's going to look at things more holistically and in a broader sense, perhaps, and not be so surgical and episodic. So he'll look at the overall relationship, but I think he's not going to run counter to a lot of the things that President Trump put into effect.
All right, thank you as always. Dan McClory there, Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities.